We're in the Gemara on Daf Lamed Aleph from Beis. We were in the middle of discussing the Mishnah. So we're holding 7 lines down, Abaya Omar. And just review for a few moments where we were yesterday and where we're getting to today, and then we'll continue. Okay, so we spoke about, let's say 2 things yesterday. Maybe they're one thing. There is this idea of hektish toys, where you made something hektish, but it was a mistake. For example, we saw yesterday where somebody where somebody was walking down the street with his friend, and he says to his friend, if the guy who's walking toward us is Binyamin, then I'm going to become a Nazir. And his friend says, if he's not Binyamin, I'll be a Nazir. So the halacha is they're both Nazirim because that's considered hektish toys. He thought it was his friend. His friend thought it wasn't his friend. So each of them made a mistake. Or I should say at least one of them made a mistake. So that's called hektish toys, and it's still valid. This Hill says it's not valid. Okay. And then we saw a second scenario which possibly relates to the first, where the guy says, the first black bull to leave my house is hektish, should be sanctified, and a white one left first. According to Beis Shammai, it's sanctified. Which one is sanctified? So if you remember from yesterday, we started off the Gemara with the opinion of the Gemara's presumption at the beginning was that which one sanctified? The white one. And then we saw the opinion of Rav Papa, which one sanctified? It's actually the first black one. And what he really meant to say was the first black one that leaves, that's the one that should be sanctified. Okay. Okay. That's where we got up to. Okay. According to this second version, the second scenario, according to the version that says that we're talking about the first black animal, the first black bull, if that's the case, then the Mishnah is actually saying 2 separate things. One is hektish toys, and the other one is it's not really hektish toys. It's that what he meant to say and what he said are slightly incongruous. In other words, what he said was the first animal to leave, and what he really meant was the first of the black animals to leave. So it's called At-Isa Diburi. He stumbled over his words. So there's really 2 things going on. One is hektish toys, and one is At-Isa Diburi. He stumbled over his words. And that was the first explanation we saw in the Mishnah. Now we're at Abaya on 7 lines down on 31b. Abaya offers an alternative explanation. There it is. Abaya Omar loy kasagadai have to come mitzafra. It's not like you're claiming that he was standing in the morning. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so Abaya says as follows. So how do we start our thinking? We're thinking that the guy is presumably standing in the morning, although the morning is not really the point here, but he has all his animals locked up in a shed, in a pen, in a corral, whatever it might be. And he's standing outside, and he says the first black animal to leave should be sanctified. And then an animal leaves. Says Abaya, no, that's what we learned until now. So he's committing toward the future. So Abaya says that's not the scenario. And what's the scenario? To come b'tiara. He's standing in the afternoon. V'amar, and he says, Shar shachar shiyatzini beisi rishon lehavi hektish. So he says the first one that has left the pen, in other words, it's post facto. An animal's already left. He says the first black animal that left should be sanctified. V'amar, and they told him, no, lova nafak. It was actually a white one that left first. V'amar lahain, he said to them, Ihav yadana the lova nafak. Had I known that a white one left, lo amri shachar, I would not have said black. I would have said white instead. So again, this is sort of a combination approach where it's sort of a hektish b'tois. He did make a mistake because he was talking about post the fact, and he thought he wanted to say black, but he would have said white as well. Abaye would agree, though, very importantly, that if a guy is standing there before the animals leave the pen, and he says the first black animal that leaves is sanctified, and a white animal leaves first, a white bull, the halacha is the white one is not sanctified, and neither is the next black one. Everyone would agree in that scenario that that is not hektish tois. However, once it's already happened, so then he's clarifying what he meant to say. In that scenario, we say it is hektish tois, and he sanctified the first. What he meant to do was sanctify the first white animal, because he's clarifying it. He's clarifying what he said immediately. Says the Gemara, "Umimas is amar tikar b'tira asik." Atira skinon v'aktani. We learned. Can you say that he's standing post facto? V'aktani. We said the Mishnah says a similar story happened with coins. Dinar shel zav sheyala, the first golden coin that I pull out of my pocket. So the Gemara says no, it doesn't mean that I will pull out of my pocket, meaning that it will happen. So Gemara says no. Tani sha'ala. In other words, the guy's already pulled the coin out of his pocket. He thinks it's a silver coin. It's actually, he thinks it's a gold coin. It's actually a silver coin. And he says, whatever's in my hand should be, the gold coin in my hand should be sanctified. He opens his hand, turns out it's silver. It's already post the fact. And therefore, he's clarified what he said. He meant any coin, and therefore the coin is sanctified. So the Gemara says, so there was a room that was filled with barrels of oil and barrels of wine, and he says the first barrel of wine that comes out. Well, if it's coming out, that means it's beforehand. Somebody says no, Tanisha also. It means it's already happened. It just doesn't know what the identity of that item is. Okay. Amar of Chisda. Chisda said, okay, it's an very interesting Gemara, and very interesting. This is clearly an Agat Gemara, and the Gemara has a very interesting framework for asking the question. So let's go through it. Amar of Chisda. Chisda says as follows: Uchma, if you have a black bull, bechivra, in a flock of white bulls, lakya, that curses the rest of the bulls. Evidently, because a black one is sort of worse than a white one. Okay. Similarly, if you have a white spot, chivra, a white spot, but uchma on a dark animal, lakya. That's, I don't know what he would do with all the Holsteins we have, which are all speckled white and black. Maybe it's just the cow, the bulls are all one color, I'm not sure. You usually only see the cow side of it. What?
No, it's afflicted.
Yeah. That's also called a disease because the white spot on a black cow is a sign that there probably was leprosy underneath it. Okay. Now, clearly here, Rav Chisda seems to indicate that the preferred color of a bull is white, and the lesser color is black, and therefore black is a sign of a bad cow. I'm sorry, a black cow in a white herd is a bad sign. It inflicts the rest of the cows. The rest of the bulls. Tanan, we learned. The Gemara is going to try to refute this claim of Rav Chisda. The claim of Rav Chisda is very simple. Black is bad. And only if you have cattle, the black spots are the bad spots, the black cattle, the bad cattle, the white ones are the good ones. Okay, the Gemara seems to say that the opposite is true. Let's get to it. So now we learn if you have a black cattle that left the house first, what's the halacha? Hektish, it's sanctified. Again, so the guy said, okay, so in other words, so the guy says the first animal to leave is the first black animal to leave is sanctified, the black cattle. And what happens? A white cattle leaves. Kasaka, we presume, ki makdish ba'ain ra makdish va'amri b'shamai have a hektish. Presumably, a person doesn't want to be so generous when he sanctifies animals of hektish. In other words, the conceptual framework here is that a guy's stingy. So in other words, if a guy, he wants to sanctify the car in the driveway, and he has a Honda Civic and a Mercedes Benz. And turns out the car in the driveway, he said, I'm not just a Civic in the driveway. It turns out there's a Mercedes in the driveway. Well, obviously, he only went the cheaper car, not the more expensive car. Similarly, when the guy says the first black sheep, and then a white sheep comes out, the Gemara's presumption is that white must be cheaper than black. In other words, the black cattle is the prestigious cattle. The white cattle is the poor cattle. V'amri b'Shamai, and b'Shamai says have a hektish. So this clearly runs counter to the opinion of Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda is saying that the black cattle is the afflicted one, is the bad one. Over here, to see the contrary, the black one is the better one. The white one is the less prestigious one. Okay, so Gemara says you're right. Okay, but Elamai must be, but ayin yafim akdish. He sanctified. When a person sanctifies, and to the contrary, he wants to be generous. He hears a Mercedes Benz in the driveway, he's even happier. Okay. So the Gemara says, "Elamai be ayin yafim akdish." So you'll go with that in explanation, but that can't be. Why? Because we see dinner shal zav sheyala biyadi rishon. The first golden coin I pull out of the pocket, right? And then he pulls out, or out of the piggy bank, whatever it is. Then he pulls out a silver coin. The silver coin sanctified. Makes a lot of sense. Hold on a second. What happens if the guy says a silver coin and then pulls out a gold coin? Evidently, the Mishnah would say that, of course, the gold coin is not sanctified, right? Because the Mishnah specifically chooses a scenario where he chooses the expensive and he prefers the expensive and chooses the cheap. But a scenario where he prefers the cheap and chooses the expensive, obviously, the halacha would be that he prefers that he wants when he gives money to hektish, he prefers to be stingy, less than the value that he intended, not more. So this proves clearly that the guy is stingy when he sanctifies things. And if the guy is stingy when he sanctifies things, the fact that a white cattle works in place of a black cattle shows you that white cattle is preferred to black. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so Moses, if that's the case, the first barrel of wine that comes out, the oil shel shaman, an oil one came out first. B'shamay says that the oil one is sanctified. Hold on a second. Oil is more valuable than wine. I don't know if this is the case today, but we'll soon see that there's a location where the opposite is true. The Gemara says, that's not okay. In other words, so if the guy says, I want wine, and he gets oil, the oil is sanctified. That's an elevation because oil is more expensive than wine. So therefore, 1 second. So therefore, that proves that you actually donate ba'ayin yafa. You're generous when you give to hektish, and that now the middle of the Mishnah is difficult. What happened with the golden coins? Why does the Mishnah specifically take a scenario where he wants gold but he finds silver? Why can't the Mishnah take the opposite scenario? Because silver clearly is less valuable than gold, where he wanted silver and he found gold and it would still be sanctified. So the Gemara says no. In other words, there seems to be a contradiction in the Mishnah. Is the guy generous or is he not generous? So the Gemara says it's not a contradiction. The oil scenario where oil is more valuable than wine is not difficult. We're talking about a place in the Galil, in the northern part of Israel, the Chamra Adaf Mishcha, where they value wine more than oil. Okay. So therefore, the Mishnah is actually aligns very nicely. The Mishnah is clearly indicating that a guy who's intending on sanctifying to something to hektish gives ba'ayin raw. He's stingy. He's not generous. 1 second. And therefore it's difficult, the first part of the Mishnah. If we know a guy is stingy and we say that he intends to take the black animal and he finds a white animal, he actually gets a white one, the white one's sanctified. Hold on, why is it sanctified? If white is better than black, you should say ba'ayin raw. He never intended to do more expensive. He only intended his Honda Civic, not his Mercedes. Gemara says, Reish Kasha Rav Chisda. The first part of the Mishnah is difficult according to the opinion of Rav Chisda. So Rav Chisda says you're right. The truth of the matter is that really black cattle are more preferred than white cattle. So what was I talking about? Ki Amri, what was I referring to? Betura de Carmenoi, the animals of Carmenoi. Does also translate that word? Carmenoi?
the species of, just the species of ox, the white variety is more valuable. The Mishnah, how it refers to ordinary species of ox,
okay.
which is the black variety is more
Got
valuable. So it's just the type of.
It's a type of cattle called a carmenoi.
Yeah.
And the carmenoi, so again, typically the black one's more prestigious than the white one. And that's what the Mishnah is referring to. Therefore, a white one works in place of a black one because a white one is less valuable. However, Rav Chizda was talking about Tur de Carmenoi, the animals of Carmenoi. In that case, the white bulls are more valuable than the black bulls. For Rav Chizda gave some signs here. Ochma, a black cattle, lemashche. They're very good for carrying. Is that a translate mashche? Oh, from the skin?
The black ox is good for its skin.
It's skin,
Red
okay.
ox for its meat.
Lamashche is for the skin.
Yeah.
Okay. Sumka, red one, lebisre for its flesh. Chivra, a white one, leradya for plowing. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Va'amar of Chizda ochma b'chivra lakya." You see that a black cattle afflicts the rest of them, and here Rav Chizda is saying that black cattle is good for its skin. So the Gemara says, "Ki amri b'tura the karmunai." Rav Chizda was talking about the cattle of karmunai, which is different than the typical advice he would give between black, red, and white. Okay, says the Mishnah. Misha Nadar ben Nazir, someone who commits to become a Nazir. V'nishal l'chacham v'asru. He goes to a rabbi and he says, "I made a mistake." We'll soon see, very soon. Hopefully, we'll get there today. There's an interesting scenario when the temple was destroyed. So people used to accept Naziris across the world, and then they'd come to the temple and they'd bring their sacrifices.
Yeah.
When they finished their Naziros. So when the temple was destroyed, a bunch of people came a couple of years later and said, "We're ready to bring our sacrifices." And the question now is, you can't, because there's no temple, there's no altar. The question is, are they still Nazirim now forever? They're stuck in Naziros. Or can we nullify their Nadarim? We'll get to that hopefully today, if not tomorrow. Okay, but sometimes you go to a rabbi, sometimes it's permitted, and sometimes it's not permitted. And God willing, we'll soon see more specifics. Yeah, we'll get to it in no, it's the next mission. But we'll get to more specifics when it would be permitted, when it wouldn't be permitted. It's a lot of what we learned already in Nadarim. We'll get to it hopefully later today, and certainly tomorrow as well. Okay. So Mishnah ben Azim initial chacham. He asks the rabbi v'asr and he forbids it. He has to count his Naziris begins at the time he accepted the Naziris. We'll see the Gemara presumes actually what happened was the guy was convinced that the rabbi would permit his neder. So he was going around drinking wine for 2 weeks. Then he went to the rabbi. The rabbi said, "Sorry, but it's not going to work." He counts his neder from the beginning. And we'll soon see the specifics. Biblically, if you become tamei during your Naziris, you lose the whole Naziris. However, if you drank wine, nothing happens biblically. You get malchus, you violated Torah law, you get whipped for doing that, but it doesn't ruin your Naziris. If you cut your hair, we said it depends. In order to shave your hair at the end of Naziris, you need 30 days. So if, for example, a guy was a Nazir for 100 days and he took a haircut on day number 60, absolutely fine. It's not fine. It's terrible. He violated Torah law, but it won't make a difference to his Naziris. His Naziris is going to be over day 100. However, if he cut his hair on day 85, his Naziris is going to be over on day 115 because he needs 30 days worth of hair growth to be able to cut his hair. Okay, that's back. We'll get to that. We'll get to those details more in the Gemara. Nishal chacham. Let's say he asks a rabbi v'hitiroi, and the rabbi permits it. So retroactively, he never was an usher. If he has an animal that he separated, the animal is chulin, and Beis Shammai agrees. This is not even a scenario of hektish tois, because the entire thing was a false premise. He's not actually Nazir. Okay. However, Beis Shammai was in Yiddish they call this an Oberchacham, an Uberchacham. He doesn't speak German. He was too smart for himself. So Beis Shammai here got into a dialogue with Beis Hill that even though they agreed to Beis Hill, they still went back and forth. It's devil's advocate in English. So what happened? So Beis Hill didn't like this response to Beis Shammai. Beis Hill says, "Hold on a second. You're telling me in this scenario, this is like a hektish b'tois, and you're agreeing that the animal's chulin." Amr Beis Hill Beis Shammai, yet the maidim is eshu hektish tois. Isn't this an example of hektish tois? You made a mistake. You sanctified an animal, and we say the animal's chulin. That's my opinion. Why do you disagree with me everywhere else? Bishamai says, hold on a second. Don't you agree with me that hektish tois works? How do I know hektish tois works? Okay, so let's pause here for a moment. There's a concept called meiser behema. You familiar with that? Meiser behema? Okay, let's explain meiser behema. Okay, in general, let's just give examples here. Meiser basically is a tithe. It's typically 10%. No, I'm sorry, not typically. Meiser is 10%. Make that very clear. Meiser is a tithe of 10%. I believe every example of the Torah used the word meiser means 10%. So the regular Jew, Yisrael, that's me. My name is not Yisrael, but I'm not a Kain or a Levi. I'm from Shevet Binyamin, according to my family tradition. And by the way, most, I have a personal family tradition for my father's father. But most people in Ashkenaz are considered, the Kabbalists say that most Ashkenazis Jews are from Shevet Binyamin. As a side note. So there shouldn't be anything unique about that. Okay, so we're from Shevet Binyamin, regular Jews. We plant the field. We have 100 bushels. 10 of those bushels go meiser to a Levi. First, obviously, we give truma to a kayin. Okay, so it's a little less than 10. It's actually 9.8%. But 9.8% is 10% of the remaining. The Levi now has 10 bushels, roughly 10 bushels of wheat. He gives one of those bushels to a kayin. That's called trumas meiser. Okay. It's meiser of my meiser. Also 10%. Another concept, that's a biblical concept, that's clear. It's in law in the times where a temple is built and the Jews are living in Israel. That is an absolute requirement. Okay, now, one second. Second. Yeah, okay. There's another another example of meiser is many have what's I would say is somewhere between halacha and minhag. It's not exactly halacha, but it's not completely a minhag. It's an old tradition. Avraham Avinu already did it, which is to give 10% of your income to charity. 10% of income or 10% of capital gains should be given to charity. That's an example of meiser. Okay. There's another thing of meiser called meiser behema. This is, again, if you live in Israel and most temples built, it's not really depending on the temple. It depends that most of the Jews live in Israel, and you raise cattle. 10% of all the newborn animals get brought as a sacrifice, called meiser behema. So what do? At the end of every year, it's typically done around Rosh Hashanah time. You take all the newborn animals, you put them in a pen, and you have a gate to another corral, and you let them go out. You count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the last one, you take a slab of red paint and you paint them red. And then you do it to the whole thing, you know which ones are the red ones, and you bring them with you on Sukkot. Okay. Okay, one second. Now, what Bishama says as follows. So again, the guy's counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then he hits the 10th animal. Let's say he makes a mistake. Says Bishama, don't you agree with me? B'misha, somebody makes a mistake. The Kollel asiri. He called the ninth animal. He said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and he whacked it with some paint. And then the 10th animal, he said, oh, 9. He whacked the 10th one with paint too. And then there was an 11th one, which he said, oh, and 10 again. So he called the ninth one and the 11th one he called 10, and the 10th one he called 9. The halacha is that all three are sanctified. It's clearly an example of hektish b'tois, and it works. So now this is again, Beishamai could have simply responded to Basil that this scenario is different than all the other scenarios. This is much worse than hektish b'tois because he's not even a Nazir. So there's no way for him to sanctify carbon of a Nazir if he's not a Nazir. It's not a mistake. You can't bring a chatos if you never sinned. It's not possible. And therefore, you can't bring carbonates of a Nazir if you're not a Nazir. But Beishamai here decided to be very smart, and instead of answering the simple explanation, he gave a more complex explanation. As you think hektish b'tois doesn't work, I have a clear example where hektish b'tois does work. It's a scenario of meiser. Basil wasn't too thrilled with that, and he's Basil responds, hold on, loy hashevet kitchay. you Beishamai recognize the guy's thing of pain to stick is not what actually makes the animal sanctified. Let's say he made this mistake by the 8th or the 12th animal. Shema asaklum, do you think that it actually works? No, it doesn't work. It's only the mistake of the 9th and 10th animal. In other words, the same God that writes in the Torah, the same God that writes in the Torah that the 8th and the 10th animal are sanctified is the same. That the 10th animal sanctified is the same one that says that the 9th and the 11th are also sanctified. Meaning that the Torah limits the mistake specifically to the 9th and the 11th animal. In other words, of course, in general, any mistake is not valid to make hekdesh. The only proof you have here from the mistake of Meiser is the fact that the Torah specifically allows you to make that mistake. The Torah says if you make that mistake, then it would be valid. So you can't prove to me in a specific scenario where the Torah sanctifies a mistake to any other scenario where the mistake would not be sanctified. Okay. That concludes the Mishnah. We're on 32a. We're at the Gemara now. Mani Masnisin. Who is our Mishnah? Lo Rabbi Yossi v'lo Rabbanan. It cannot be the opinion of Rabbi Yossi or the opinion of the Rabbanan. Let's explain this. The Tanya we learned. Mi shenadar v'over al Nazirusay. A guy became a Nazir, and he violated his Nazirus. He drank wine. Again, we said biblically, if you drink wine, it's a very bad thing to do. It's a terrible thing to do. However, it doesn't impact your Nazirus. If you drink wine on all 30 days of your Nazirus, you're still a Nazir, you still end your Nazirus on day 30 according to the biblical law. However, the rabbis were not thrilled that a Nazir here is going to violate all his Nazirus every single day and bring a korban on the 30th day. They said you can't come until you're sober for 30 days. And again, obviously, a Nazir is allowed to drink hard liquor. We use the word sober here in a non-sober term. The Tanya Misha Nadav over on Nazirus. Somebody who makes a neder and he violates his Nazirus. Einis kakan lai. We don't accommodate his karbonos, the conclusion of his Nazirus. El imkein meide behen iser kiyam shenag behem heter. For every day that he violated his Nazirus, he needs to keep. In other words, for every day that he drank wine, we count another day that he must remain sober from wine. 1 second. Rabbi Yossi says, it's going to be just 30 days. 30 days is enough. Meaning, let's say the guy has, so Rabbi Yossi basically says it depends. Let's say the guy has a standard Nazirus, 30 days, and he drinks wine every single day. Then he has to count another 30 days. Let's say he drinks wine for 15 days. He counts another 15 days. However, exactly the same as the first opinion. And again, all this is rabbinic. However, let's say he becomes, it's rabbinic. It's a rabbinic enactment. Biblically,
45 days.
An extra 15 days. Now, let's say he has 100-day Nazirus, and he was drinking for 75 days. So Rabbi Yossi says the penalty is that he needs to count another 30 days of sobriety from wine. So it would be 25 plus 30 days, 55 days where he does not consume wine. 1 second. Okay, okay, so the Gemara says, okay, now this seems to contradict our Mishnah because our Mishnah seems to indicate that if a guy goes to the rabbi and the rabbi says, sorry, but I can't permit your Nazir. He counts his Nazirus from the beginning of his Nazirus. Presumably that until that point, he violated his Nazirus. He presumably was drinking. If he became Tameh, obviously that would not be the case. Because if he became Tameh, he would have to restart his Nazirus, like any other Nazir that becomes Tameh. So it's clearly not what happened. The violation must have been a violation of drinking. And presumably, and the Mishnah seems to indicate you don't have to count at all. According to the rabbis, even a small Nazirus is difficult because you have to count as many days that you would as you were drinking. According to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, kasha Nazirus meruba. A longer Nazirus is difficult because whatever it is, it's a minimum an additional 30 days. Or less for a smaller Nazirus, but a bigger Nazirus, minimum 30 days. I'm sorry, maximum 30 days. So the Gemara says, "Ibayis Tamer B'Yasi, Ibayis Tamer Rabbanan." It could be either opinion. Ibayis Tamer B'Yasi, Kam Benaziris Meruba, Kam Benaziris Muatas. So, according to Rabbi Yossi, it would be as follows. Rabbi Yossi could say that our Mishnah is talking about a scenario of a large Nazirus. It's a long Nazirus, and the Mishnah says that, in other words, the guy was drinking wine for a long time, 65 days, and then he went to ask a rabbi, and the rabbi said, "You're still a Nazir." So he has 65 days, but he only counts an additional 30 days. So when the Mishnah says you count from the beginning of your Nazirus, it means that some of those days between the period of when you became a Nazir until you went to ask the rabbi that you violated your Nazirus, some of those days count. Not all, but some. So therefore, that would make sense according to Rabbi Yossi. According to Rabbi Yossi, it would make sense because we're talking about a large Nazirus. Of those 65 days, 35 of them will count. Another 30 you'll have to keep. So you see that some of the days before he asked the rabbi do count for the Nazirus. Okay. Or you can go according to the rabbi's opinion. According to the rabbis, you'd have to change the Mishnah. You'd have to say that when the Mishnah says you count as many days as there were between when he became a Nazir and he asked the rabbi, the Mishnah doesn't mean that those days actually count. But what the Mishnah means is you have to count that those days actually don't count, and that those days have to be added to the end. That amount of time between when he accepted the Nazirus and he asked the rabbi have to be added and counted again, because presumably he violated his Nazirus. Okay. Start the next Gemara. They went to the rabbis and the rabbis permitted it. And Beis Shammai agrees in this scenario, a scenario where the rabbi retroactively revokes his Nazirus, that the karbonos are not sanctified. Rav Yirmiyah says, Rav Yirmiyah, Mida Beis Shammai Nishma Beis Hillel. From the opinion of Beis Shammai, we can understand the opinion of Beis Hillel. Lav Amri Beis Shammai. Don't Beis Shammai say, Hektish b'tois have a hektish. That Beis Shammai in general say, if you make a mistake, the sanctification is still valid. And therefore, Kivan de Gloy Milsa de Lav Shaper Nazar, Teitzi V'tir Be'eder. 1 second. Okay. In other words, even though Beis Shammai typically hold if you make a mistake, it remains sanctified. In this scenario, they say it is not sanctified. The Beis Hillel nami, according to Beis Hillel as well. Afagav da'amri tumur b'tois havet tumura. Hadi mili hecha the isil ikar hektish. Hecha the mitzakar ikar hektish is akar nami tumura. Okay. So what does this mean? Where is Beis Shammai's original source of hektish b'tois have a hektish? The source is tumura. Tumura is when you try to move the sanctification from one animal onto another animal. Where we say that it's a prohibition, you violate the prohibition, it doesn't actually work, and both animals are sanctified. If you do it by mistake, it's the same story. However, what happens according to Beis Shammai, hektish twice have a hektish, which means once you say this animal is an isla, it will always be an isla. So obviously in a scenario, according to Beis Hillel says, no, let's say you go to a rabbi and you ask to revoke it, you didn't realize that was Aunt Sally's favorite sheep, and you didn't want to bring that as an Eilah, so the rabbi revokes the neder. Fine. According to Beis Hillel, let's say somebody did Tmura beforehand. So you sanctify the animal, a guy does Tmura, and then he revokes the neder retroactively. Is the Tmura also revoked retroactively? So Gemara says, just like according to Beis Shammai, that says hektish b'tois have a hektish. In a scenario where you became a Nazir and you had your Nazirus revoked, your karbonos are also revoked, also chulin. Similarly, according to Beis Hillel, if you sanctify an animal, you do Tmura, and then you revoke the sanctification retroactively, the Tmura is also revoked. Okay. Together? Okay, but halfway down the page, 2 dots, Amar Mar. So we have this debate here between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, right? Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel with regard to Meiser Behema. Beis Shammai says, look, Meiser Behema, you make a mistake, you call the 9th and the 11th number 10, and you call the 10th one number 9, all three are sanctified. Proves, says Beis Shammai, this proves my opinion. Hektish b'tois have a hektish. And Beis Hillel is not impressed. Beis Hillel says, no, it's exeris akosov, meaning the same God that said the 10th one is sanctified says you can make a mistake, but only in number 9 and number 11. It's not just a generic mistake, because if you make a mistake in number 7 or 8 or 12 or 13, mistake is not sanctified. Itmar. Meiser. We learned in the halacha of Meiser behema. Rav Nachman Amar to usay v'loy kavanasay. Rav Chizr v'Rabbi Rabhuna Amri to usay v'kolshkin kavanasay. Rav Nachman says it's only if you made a mistake, but if you actually said it on purpose, it doesn't work. In other words, the Torah says that the 10th and the 11th, the 9th and the 11th are sanctified only when you call them 10 as a mistake. You lost track of your counting. But if you intentionally made the mistake, they're not sanctified. Whereas Rav Chizr and Rabbi Rav Huna say both, whether it was a mistake or whether it wasn't a mistake, they're sanctified. So in other words, if you intentionally call 9 10, you do this thing intentionally, it also works. Amrle Rav Rav Nachman. So Rav says to Rav Nachman, according to what you're telling me, that it's a mistake, that only a mistake is sanctified in this scenario of Meiser Behema, and not if you intentionally call the 9th and the 11th 10. Dika Amri Beishamai LeBeisil, Iatamaydim Shilu Karl Chiasir Lasir Chilach La'achar Asar Asiri Shishloshn Mikadoshin Vishtika Beisil Lamer Lahain. In other words, when Beishamai asked Beisil this question, that fact that 9 and that I can prove to you Hektish Tois is valid because the 9th and the 11th are also sanctified. Why doesn't Beis Hill have the following retort? Lamer Lahain. Beis Hill should respond as follows. There's a dramatical difference between Hektish and Meiser, because by Meiser the mistake is sanctified, but not the intention. Intentionally, you can only sanctify the 10th one. If you're with a clear mind and a proper count, you can only sanctify the 10th one. It just doesn't work. You can't say the 8th one is sanctified. It doesn't work that way. There's no such system. That you can make it into a shlum if you want, or an arla. You can't make it into Meiser. It doesn't work. Whereas Hektish, you can do whatever you want. You can make any animal sanctified. Even, as a matter of fact, like we saw earlier, you can make a female into an arla or a male into a chatas, and it will work too. We just have to sell the animal and take care of it that way. But it has the same level of sanctification. So you can't really compare Meiser and Hektish because Hektish is sort of a much wider framework. Meiser is a limited framework. The only thing you can make Meiser is a 10th animal or a mistake. You can't make anything else Meiser, even if you had intention. So therefore, there's no comparison. Beis Shammai can't prove from Meiser that Hektish Tois have a Hektish, because obviously it's a unique story to Meiser. So Rasim Barashi, so Rasim Barashi says the reason why he didn't respond is because, if anything, that's even a greater proof. In other words, Ma Meiser she'ein kodesh b'kavana, kodesh b'tois, Hektish kodesh b'kavana lo kolshken. In other words, if Meiser, which has a limited framework, if you make a mistake, the mistake is still valid. So certainly in a wider framework, that would certainly be true. If even in a limited framework, a mistake is valid, and this is a limited framework, typically you'd think that only every 10th one could be sanctified, whether or not you make a mistake. So certainly, and the mistake is still valid, certainly in a case where a much wider framework, you can sanctify whatever you want effectively, then certainly it should be sanctified, and mistakes should also be sanctified. So Gemara says v'lohi, and that's not a proper comparison. Hektish b'dayt demore toli, because the limited framework indicates that it's a different type of framework. It's not dependent on what you think, whereas Hektish is very much dependent on what you think. And therefore, you can't compare Meiser to Hektish because in some ways Hektish is the more limited scenario, because Hektish requires your own intentions. Meiser does not, and therefore the Gemara is saying that it still would have been appropriate for Beis Hill to respond to Beis Shammai as follows. In other words, and this does support the second opinion that Meiser would work both b'kavana and shaloi b'kavana. B'tois and b'kavana, that if the guy called the 9th and the 11th animal the 10th animal, whether it was a mistake or whether it was on purpose, both scenarios, they would be sanctified. What time is it? 57? Okay, we'll stop here. All right. Tomorrow, I will take a poll. It looks like we'll have snow-covered ground tomorrow.